Right. Well, thank you for coming tonight and viewing this this fantastic documentary with us. And thank you, of course, to the panelists for agreeing to be on this wonderful event. So you all come from you all bring different perspectives to the topics discussed in the film. So I think it'd be a good place to start would be your particular reactions to the film and the many different themes that it brings up, from the corporate ownership of housing, the criticism of that, the municipalism, the underlying vision of a participatory democracy that runs through the whole film, and that empowers the party there, and of course connections with local San Francisco Bay Area as well as California issues. So I think we'll just go ahead and begin. How about we'll start from the far end of the table. Professor Iglesias.
Hi, welcome everyone. I think this is a great thing to be doing instead of listening to the State of the Union address. First of all, I just want to clarify that there was a number. My name is Tim Iglesias, and there was a number of references to Pablo Iglesias. I just want to make clear I'm not related to him, but I am related to Santiago Iglesias Pantin from the north of Spain, who emigrated from Spain, went to Puerto Rico, and co-founded the Socialist Party there. So anyway, that's just to clarify. But I just thought, for me, the film was very rich. For me, it's like a leftist, feminist Rocky, but without the soundtrack. Yeah. They did. So anyway, I found, so touch on a couple themes. First of all, I did find it very inspiring and empowering. Secondly, I felt it was trying to rehabilitate politics in a good way. I felt that it suggested housing can be a successful organizing issue. I thought, as a lawyer, I have to say, it also brings up the importance of the law and the limits of the law. And it raises this notion of municipalism, which is a political theory about cities kind of trying to determine their own fate. And I think that's very interesting. And then just two quick other things. One is this transition between activism and electoral politics, I think is a really important theme. And then the notion of being authentic in politics and the struggles they faced around authenticity while still being in electoral politics. And then finally, the big theme of to what degree can a city and a party change the system and with all the powers that be. So I just thought it is very, very rich.
Fantastic. Go ahead.
Looking at things through a very San Francisco lens, which is what I do as a San Francisco reporter, I felt envious because it's very hard to envision something like this happening here. The level of cohesiveness among leftists was frankly incredible. And especially with the meetings where I mean, David to my left has been to more boards of supervisors meetings than most anybody, and I was surprised that maybe they edited out the crazy commentary. But again, the level of cohesiveness was astounding. And then, in order to win a citywide election from the left and organizing around housing issues was very hard to get your head around on a San Francisco level. Another thing is, after I watched this film the first time last week, I looked up Barcelona and was shocked that it's 5.5 million people. This is not a small city. It's bigger than any city in the United States other than New York City. It's bigger than Chicago. So for someone like this to win a city like that it's beyond my capabilities of understanding as an American citizen and as a San Franciscan since birth.
Fantastic.
Since birth, wow.
That's rare.
Good evening, everyone. And let me first start by just thanking the Film Festival for what you're doing to raise up these issues. Give it up for the Film Festival. Yes. My first thought, in addition to the fact of what we're doing right now as opposed to watching another crazy reality TV show by our current so-called occupant of the White House, is if we were watching this in a time of Obama or John F. Kennedy, I think it would strike us a little differently than the time we're in right now, right? the optimism that this is about people power, being able to move things forward. It's about giving us hope. I have to say, I want to buy a ticket to Barcelona and check it out. So that was one thing that struck me. A second thing that struck me, I have to admit, as someone who has been a candidate, the PTSD of watching what happens to first-time candidates. I was having flashbacks to any first-time candidates' experiences of having photographs taken of you and seeing it on mail and having people critique you as a person in ways that are really unnatural. And there is something about the process that is really odd and strange and not particularly, I think, uplifting. And one thing I've always liked about the European system is the fact that it's a system that promotes ideas and party over personality and individuals and brands. And that's always a tension. It's certainly in our American system, it's about the personality much more than it is about the fight of ideas. I think the last thing I will say is sort of these themes of challenges around housing and mortgages and banks. These are the themes of today, of right this moment in 2020 America, 2020 California, 2020 San Francisco, and how she and her team was able to grapple with it was incredibly inspiring.
Yeah.
Greetings. As a born and raised third generation West Oaklander, thank you for having me on this side of the bridge. But I think that, and as coming from a city of 420,000 people, this vision is actually very possible for our city and our region. As a former candidate for Oakland City Council, where we were all volunteer, all grassroots, and only lost against an entrenched incumbent by 1,500 votes, we know for a fact that housing is the organizing issue of the day, right? It is the device and the fulcrum around which you can mobilize and create awareness among individuals and communities, because it's become such a critical lever point of community cohesion in the future of our urban cities nationwide, because we're all experiencing this. We're all subject to the demands of tech and reserve labor that is shifting the labor demands back into the urban city and displacing our longtime and legacy residents out to more ruralized areas with less representation, less jobs, less access to transportation, really taking a hit on our environmental goals, our social goals. And what I also can see here in the early debate where the challenger, Ada, was asked by the incumbent, is it really the city's job to make sure that folks are not displaced, to make sure the market is a fair place? If that's not our municipality's job, what is it? Right? And when we ran for city council, one of the critical things we heard from the incumbent when we chose to challenge her was, why do our cities look the way we do? And the response was, this is the free market and they have no control over it. But the thing is the free market is people making choices. And being from District 3, the district that has thrown the doors wide open to unchecked speculative development, which has affected property rates in our whole region. It spilled over to all of the cities, Berkeley, Emeryville, Hayward, right? That is our only job, to protect our cities, to protect our histories, and to protect our stories. And Ada was able to tap into that, whether she did it through homeowners or renters, this contrast between the populism and the municipalism. She was able to tap into a basic need that activates people across the spectrum. So in a 420,000 person city, learning from the lessons of San Francisco, we know it's very possible, and we're working on that movement in our side of the Bay.
420,000 is a lot more than voted in the Iowa caucus.
That's right.
Just a thought.
And Bernie had the popular vote.
Yeah. So I want to take up, you guys, all of you, up on the issue of municipalism a little bit, really starting from where you left off about the possibility of it and how it motivates people across, right, the spectrum, linking on issues, starting with issues of housing and dealing with really particular issues that unites them all. And also Also repping Oakland, so, so, yeah, we try to get folks from over the Bay, and maybe we'll go over there one day. All right, so municipalism, right, is this political philosophy, as Tim said, about how cities can be in charge and how cities can change things, and also how those cities are motivated by the people who live there, right, and encourage them to get actively involved in democracy. So it's a form of participatory democracy, but bounded around, right, the city and using the city identity to motivate them. Is this possible? Each of you talked a little bit about this idea, right? And I'd like you to say more about municipalism and how it fits into, current situations in the Bay Area. Let's start with you. You had a lot to say. Yeah.
Well, when Faye and I were chatting about that concept, I considered it having an identity with how we're trying to activate our electorate in Oakland and District 3 in particular. But she made a fine distinction that what I'm talking about activating are cultures and history versus a geographic or an economic attachment, right? And so I feel like that if we understand ourselves to be cultural actors and cultural bodies in all the things we do, in our bureaucratic productions, in our political productions, not just in our explicitly qualitative or as humanities in our humanistic productions, that the boundaries of the city, it's a place of the imagination, right? It's where the lines start and stop, what you understand your city to be, how you understand its potentials. That's a symbolic image that's held and agreed upon between actors in a physical space. So the idea of protecting a city is really what change is hinging on in Oakland right now. We've seen how, forgive me, the character and the nature of San Francisco has been radically transformed to this other space of the imagination when we were taking it so blithely that commercial developers could define our cities and our histories and our stories and our futures for us. So they're very much, in our opinion, one and the same, that what you believe are your city's potentials or where you're going to find yourself in 20, 50, and 100 years.
I love that. So thinking about municipalism and not being bounded by the city or municipal borders, but rather as a field for our public political culture and our social imaginary, as you say, right? So it's bigger than the city, but draws us all together. What about you, Assembly?
I have a lot of thoughts just thinking about this movie and some of the comments that were made. First and foremost, obviously I am a San Francisco booster. There is something just very special about our 7x7 square miles and the fact that we are a city and a set of progressive cities here that is a beacon to the rest of the world when it comes to tolerance and diversity and civil rights and bringing people together from all sorts of backgrounds who seek to be here, whether it be immigrants or our LGBT community or folks that are looking to find and create their California dream or their San Francisco dream. But I will say that I think there's a danger in focusing just on the boundaries of a city. In San Francisco, we have these very intense fights amongst ourselves on all sorts of things, and we slice and dice political differences. And as a state legislator who has now spent a lot more time thinking about issues at levels above one city and looking at regions in the state, so much of what I see as the challenges facing San Francisco are challenges that are exacerbated by the fact that we're just focused on the experience of individual cities and not looking at ourselves as a region. So let me talk about just housing for a moment. We fight about huge development fights around what happens in 7x7 square miles, and we don't think about the fact that we're surrounded by literally another 100 cities here in the Bay Area, in a 9-county region, where the vast majority of these cities and counties are doing nothing to address our housing crisis. And there are hundreds of thousands of jobs that are being created in jurisdictions outside of ours, where those workers are competing to work in our city. And yet we think of ourselves as bound by the 7 by 7 square miles. And if we just lifted ourselves up a little bit and realized this is a regional phenomenon that we need to grapple with, but it's often hard if you just focus on the municipalization of one city. And so I often talk with leaders from other cities, and we're really trying to knit together a different way of sort of thinking about this. I'll give one other example that I discussed in the Chronicle today, which is we have, in addition to housing and homelessness crises, transportation crises, congestion, mad congestion. And the fact of the matter is we have 27 transit agencies in the Bay that aren't knit together, have different schedules and connections and fares and all these things. If they were better connected, congestion in our city would be addressed in a significant way. I could go on and on about issues that transcend these boundaries. So there are a lot of things that we can grapple with and we can dream on within our city boundaries, but I also think it's important to think a little bit beyond our city boundaries and how we can all work together.
Great.
I was going to bring that up if you didn't. If you wish to take transit between here and Emeryville, you have to go through 3 or 4 different agencies, and it's actually less cost beneficial than driving, which is the worst message you can have. So thank you for doing that. I agree with everything you said, Noni, but also it always struck me as odd, and that here in San Francisco we can have such pitched battles about dozens of units, whereas you've got the Brisbane land sitting and lying fallow, and that's thousands of units. And the situation up in Concord is dire. That project could founder, and that's 13,000 units right by transit. So, these are all very important things. I have very strong thoughts about what San Francisco is, but we are part of a region, and we can never do it by ourselves. My old writing partner Benjamin Wax and I always used to say that San Francisco cannot solve America's problems. San Francisco cannot solve America's homeless crisis. San Francisco cannot solve America's problem of not putting money into federal housing. So we can do a lot, and we have done a lot, but we can't do it all, and we will fail if we try to do it all and don't get any help from the state and the feds.
Tim?
Thanks. Yes, I agree. So I think municipalism and regionalism and federal, we have to hold these concepts in tension because the units exist legally, and they're cities, charter cities and general law cities in California have limits. The state government can do things and require them to do things or allow them to do things. I agree that most of the issues we care about, housing, jobs, transportation, the environment, are regional, at least. And so a municipality has only a certain amount of power and authority and control and needs to work with and figure out how to influence higher levels of government. Certainly, housing is the thing that I focus on a lot. Since the Reagan administration, the federal government has essentially withdrawn from affordable housing for the most part. Mm-hmm. And we're never going to get the resources to create enough affordable housing unless the federal government gets back in the game. We can do bonds, we can do all kinds of things, but there's just not enough resources at the local level. We have to get the resources at least from the other levels.
Noni? Yeah.
I would add to that as we'll never have enough affordable housing until the stigma is removed from affordable housing.
Yes.
And we as cities, municipalities, and regions prioritize that as a high political issue. Mm-hmm. We know from Richard Rothstein that the original model for affordable housing was actually workforce housing, mm-hmm. meant to uplift our citizens, mm-hmm. so that they could move to the next level in our mobile society that is America. Mm-hmm. So if we continue to depend on our politicians for their priorities, then we'll wait until it becomes our priority, until we understand ourselves as responsible for our neighbors and the transformation of our cities. It will never be a political priority, regionally or otherwise.
Right. I mean, so these are really important topics that you lighted on and that you mentioned. There is the concern about regionalism, right? Because these issues are bigger than the city of Oakland, and bigger than the city of San Francisco, and that we're affected by the cities that surround us. And then their refusal to build housing for all the people and all the jobs that they create, and thus flooding our rental market, right? Or their refusal to build affordable housing, or to support fair housing policies, and so on. So this is a huge issue. Is this a serious limitation to municipalism? The fact that, right, that these problems are regional, and ricochet are not just located in San Francisco, but affect the locals, the cities that surround us, all the way out and throughout the state, right? So that's a real serious limit to regionalism, and you see it perhaps in the debates and the concerns around say debates around SB 50, right, as well. And so who has the right to tell the city what to do with their land, and who to house? And if this is a regional problem, well, maybe we need to step on some cities and get them to do stuff, right? So I want to explore this tension there a little bit about, whether or not regionalism can be dealt with through this sort of municipal thinking.
Well, can I jump in on one thing? So Assemblymember Chu will remember the number of the bill. Thank you very much for all the work you've done. But there's a bill that passed the legislature this year that enables the region of the Bay Area to have a taxing authority to build more housing. Mm-hmm. And so there's and I don't know if it's going to make people worried or anxious, but now we do have the potential for a form of regionalism with regard to housing, at least funding of affordable housing in the Bay Area, which is new. And thank you very much.
I should probably jump in. So thank you for mentioning my bill, AB 1487. I want to thank, we have a number of housing advocates here in this room who were very helpful on that. So the rationale behind the bill is the fact that we do have 101 cities, we have 9 counties, but only a small fraction of them have actually devoted the resources they need to prioritize affordable housing. And as was just mentioned, when you have the city of Brisbane just south of us, who has said, we're going to create a couple thousand jobs, and when their former mayor was asked where they're going to live, he literally said they're going to live in San Francisco. When the city of Cupertino brings this new beautiful Apple spaceship into the center of town, and I'm jealous of any of you who work at Apple, 11,000 workers, and the mayor of Cupertino says we don't have a housing challenge and we should throw up our walls for folks who think that we ought to build more housing. When we have dozens of East Bay communities, suburban communities around BART stations who have forbidden and not allowed BART to develop its own land into housing and mixed-use development, we have a challenge. And so I was asked to move forward this bill with affordable housing advocates who wanted everyone in the region to be pitching in. And so we do have an opportunity this November to consider a regional ballot measure to raise money for affordable housing all over the region, not just in San Francisco or in Oakland, but Marin, Silicon Valley, the East Bay, right? And we need to do this. We need all parts of the Bay to be part of this. And that's what I mean by if we just lift our heads up just a little and see what's happening with our neighbors, it creates a different perspective on this issue of municipalization and regionalism.
Okay, good. Anyone else? Go ahead.
I wanted to add another lift to that in the sense that even our definitions need some retuning when we talk about this demand to build for affordable housing, because we discuss it as a housing crisis, but there are about 20,000 vacant units right now, but they're overpriced, and most folks who live and work here can't afford them.
Right.
So in one sense, we actually have a distribution crisis.
Right.
And so when we define affordable housing, we define it on the basis of future speculative labor populations, where we know the average Black Oaklanders' income is at about $36,000. The average white Oaklander is at about $80,000. And affordable starts at, my numbers might be a little off, affordable starts at about 80 to 110. So if we're 4,000 affordable units down for Oakland or the Bay Area, we're actually building that housing still for future labor populations and not for our residents here who are insecure, who are under housing crisis, who are housing unstable, who are simply out on the pavement. There's like 4 different categories. So there's the folks who are living under freeways, the folks who are itinerant and living in substandard housing, the folks who are couch surfing, and the folks who are always rent burdened. And so when we're working these policies, they need to be contemplating what affordable housing means for actual income levels as they exist right now That's one of the places I would love to see these bills take account of the people who are actually here and not future speculative labor populations.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
No, that's great. We need more affordable housing. We need to rethink distributive justice, right, to make sure that we can all enjoy the benefits and equally share the burdens of living in this area and have them not fall on the poorest and the most vulnerable around us. And we also need to enforce the Fair Housing Act far better than we do, right? Far better than we do. You know, I want to keep on, because I'm a philosopher, I'm a political philosopher who thinks about our housing justice. I want to think about, right, these limits around municipalism, because we've heard from the panelists the issues with the other cities around us, right? With say, you know, Moraga not wanting to build affordable housing, not wanting to build up high, right, density. I mean, I think we could pick on some of the neighborhoods in San Francisco as well for getting for getting in the way of dense building and housing people, right? These are examples all over the place. But you have this vision within Ada for mayor of municipalism, of the people, the local people making the change, right? But those local people, right, their democracy can get excessive, and they can stop these policies that you're, for example, supporting, that you see you need, right, that we need, if they're not taking all of our interests seriously, not just current residents, but future residents, and the people who've been displaced because of you know, bad development, right? So is there anything there in municipalism then, given this tension?
Well, this was a much bigger city.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a city of 5.5 million. I mean, they are the people.
Right.
So I mean, again, looking at things in proportion, we do have a patchwork of cities here, but 5.5 million is the whole region.
Right.
You know, or at least a significant portion of the region. So it's hard to make analogs, and that's always gonna hamstring me because I can't see anything past San Francisco. I always am looking at the examples of how does it relate to San Francisco, because that's what I do. But this is a truly large city, you know, bigger than most anything we have here in the United States, other than New York City.
Good. Yeah.
So.
Right, so there's that tension there, but still there's something there that's really worthy of pulling out. It's interesting how Ada used issues around eviction and displacement to power her movement. So let's go to that idea, right? What's the role of housing in broad political movements? Each of you have also spoken to that a little bit, right? Both, you know, in terms of actual local politics, as you have, Noni, and in motivating the electorate, right? So what is the issue? So in that issue, what is the role of housing in broad political movements? For example, in the Right to the City movement that we see all over the country and in the world, right? How important is this to motivate us into action? You want to speak? Yeah.
If you had asked me this question a couple years ago of how important housing is to kind of broader social movements, I don't know if I would have said it's sort of central to the concerns, but I think the fact of the matter is housing, homelessness, these are the very top issues today. And in Sacramento, where I work Monday to Thursdays, some of the biggest progressive victories we've had this past year have all stemmed from the housing crisis. And there are ADAs all over the state of California who are fighting for the very fight that we just watched on this documentary. This past year, we passed the strongest tenant protections that our state has ever experienced in decades. That would not have happened but for activists all over the state who had lost year after year after year on bill after bill after bill until finally people power won. This past year, the governor signed a bill that would allow for the establishment of something that was a reaction to what banks did around the mortgage foreclosure crisis. So a decade ago, Great Recession, we had low-income communities of color all over the state who were being foreclosed upon. And out of that came a movement, the public banking movement, to essentially say, as a community, as a city, as a state, we invest hundreds of billions of dollars in Wall Street banks that are pillaging our communities. And last year, people came around on this idea that when it was first brought to me, I thought was just absolutely impossible. But we were able to get our bill passed that would finally allow cities like Oakland and San Francisco to establish a public bank, which means we get to keep our money in our communities, invest it in our people, in our affordable housing, in our infrastructure, in our parks, and whatnot, in a way that we've never before. This has all come from the challenges of the housing crisis. And so at this moment, I'm hopeful. I think this is people power reacting to a crisis that's actually leading to something.
Fantastic. Tim, you look like you want to.
Sure. So I think I do believe housing can be the motivating, grounding force for good organization, political organization. And part of that is because I think it's becoming more and more clear to people that housing isn't just the place where you live, it's where you have opportunity for good schools, for good jobs, for decent shopping, for opportunities for, so people see now that housing isn't just a place where you live, it's your link to opportunity in your life. And I guess the big thing I'd say is, as far as housing as a basis for organizing is, I think historically in the United States, we have conducted our housing law and policy debates using certain frames, right? So one is housing as an economic good, which is a very strong frame and which is used a lot to, it's a good thing, but also it hammers people. There's housing as home, which grounds certain kind of rights and privileges, and there's a lot about housing as home, but there's housing as a human right, which is another frame in which we debate. And that's a very powerful frame to move social change. And so I think, the movements that want to change things need to also take into account how we talk about things and tap into and sort of group the frames. Because, for example, and I'll end, one of the reasons that home ownership has become and has been so successful as a federal policy for so long is that the people who are pushing it, which was largely banks and mortgage realtors, have been able to meld together the frames of housing's an economic good, housing's your home, housing's, they meld the frames. And what we need to do is figure out how to meld the frames to get support for what we want to do.
Fantastic. Noni, yeah.
Yeah, I actually wanted to sort of needle you a little bit on how you phrased that question.
Okay.
Because the film started with Ada discussing the depoliticization
That's right.
of what we need as citizens in our cities, and you use the term excessive democracy.
Yeah.
And that implies that there is some that has a negative valence when we're talking about citizens reclaiming their citizenship in cities. Thank you so much for those framings.
Yeah.
In that, I'm actually on the board of Oakland's Public Bank. We're trying to get the paperwork through right now. And we're super
Go.
excited about that. Thank you so much. But that is an excessively democratic process.
Right.
We sit through long meetings, and we have to listen to everyone's opinion,
Right.
whether we like it or not.
Exactly.
Our emails must be polite, nonviolent, open to transformation. That is an excessive democracy, but it's relearning and reteaching us a method of civic activation that allows us to understand that our cities, our futures, our homes belong to us, and they are more than a commodity.
Right.
When our role in cities are as consumers of commodities, we, as Ada reminds us, we forget who we are and why we're here.
Right.
And so I just wanted to sort of...
No, that's great. I mean, the excessive democracies that I'm worried about are the kind that you mentioned with the Rothstein book, right? Where people using democratic powers to exclude people.
Yeah.
So that's the worry, right? But you're right that we need a different kind of excessive democracy where we get involved and we fight for our rights, right?
Yeah.
So this is the question. I mean, and then I'd like to swing to the audience as well about, right, how do we use housing to organize these broad political movements, which is what your work is all about, too. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if we're at an inflection point, but it's possible to win and lose at the same time. And I'm inspired by the work that you're doing, and I'm glad that this is happening. But we are 12 years out of the heart of the recession, and many of the vulture capitalists who did the best are now, in the White House. So something to look at is that here in San Francisco, we were comparatively less devastated than the rest of the state because of the skewed home ownership ratio in San Francisco. I think it's 1/3 ownership, 2/3 renters. But where it hit us the hardest was in Bayview, Hunters Point, and minority communities. But sadly, I think that much of the woe was seen as the kind of thing that happens in Bayview, and that many of the people who don't go to Bayview and aren't concerned with radiation or various things like that. It's like, well, that's a problem. That's what happens in that part of town.
Right.
So I'm very heartened that we have reached the point we have a decade and change later, but it took a while. And the actual people who suffered are in Antioch if they're lucky, and so it doesn't. This is a good path, but it doesn't have to succeed. So hopefully it will.
Great. So in the time we have left, we have time for questions from the audience? So go ahead.
Very interested in the section.
How did you know?
More that what I understand, the movie can only be so long. And so my question is such a thing like that possible here? Whoever wants to take the question.
Coalition building.
I was told I should start. I don't think anything significant happens in politics without coalition building, period. Every major movement that's ever happened is about that. I'll use the example of the tenant law that we passed last year. It started with tenant advocates who had been toiling in the trenches and had been handed loss after loss after loss over year after year after year. But on top of that, or added labor. Right, labor movements came in and said we've got to do better. Civil rights community who said that we can talk about, say, a child's right to education, but we don't talk about the right to housing, right, in a way in which we should. Ironically, business leaders actually became part of this coalition because they said if we can't provide protections for our workers to live in their homes, they're going to be evicted and they're going to move out of the region. And I could go on and on of the different communities that came together representing communities of diversities, seniors, young people that were part of this movement. And I fundamentally believe there really is nothing significant that happens in any political world if it doesn't happen in coalition. You have folks who are the vanguard of the movement, but then you have others who see their struggle in the particular fight of the day and join together, and that's how you win.
Great. Anyone else want to address the question?
To answer your question, yeah, I think it's possible, but also it's in a European context, it's a more out in the street culture. You can get 500,000 people marching through the street in Europe over adjustments to labor rules that people would be not paying attention to here. But I agree with David. I agree it could happen, and I agree that change won't happen without it.
Fantastic. So you had a question? Okay. Go ahead.
So my question is to you, Assembly Member. When are we going to see more affordable home ownership instead of building so many, affordable housing that's for rental that isn't permanent and that also puts an undue burden on families being able to be prosperous? Earlier today we were with Bob Friedman and we were discussing this, is that the land, like we've got barred land, we've got other land, and we're talking about putting more rentals on that land and more rentals that aren't public. So is there any, is there anything that we can see in these bills for affordable home ownership, and particularly on public land?
It's a great question. The reality is we just have to build a lot more housing, so we have housing that tenants can live in and homeowners can live in. And one thing I'll say is our system actually in many ways is skewed toward home ownership if you have money, right? The largest housing financing program that exists today is called the mortgage interest deduction. In the state of California, while we spend literally pennies on affordable housing programs or in programs for homeless folks, estimated about $10 billion a year of tax breaks to Californians because of federal and state mortgage interest deduction. And it is a program designed for homeowners, but it's really designed for individuals who are very wealthy to be able to consolidate that wealth by being able to purchase homes. And this is actually a topic I'm delving into right now, because while economists across the spectrum, from progressive to conservative, will tell you giving tax breaks to pay for the interest for someone to have a mortgage actually doesn't increase homeownership. It just allows wealthy people to accumulate wealth. I want to give one of my pet examples of this. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but my guess is, if looking out into this room, maybe a third of the folks here are lucky enough to own a home. My guess is very few people in this room own 2 homes. Your first primary home and then a vacation home. Not talking about a rental where you make money, but a vacation home. In California, if you own a vacation home, you get 2 tax breaks. You get a federal mortgage interest deduction, and you get a state mortgage interest deduction on a vacation home. We provide tax breaks as a society for wealthy people to own 2 homes before we provide a home to everyone else, particularly folks who are homeless on the streets. And so I proposed that we end that tax break and we provide that money to folks who are homeless and folks who are struggling. Anyone who reads the papers in Sacramento knows that my bill is going to have a very uphill battle unless a coalition comes together to say, we just got to do it differently.
Absolutely. Good, yeah.
And I think I want to make you and everyone else in the room aware of something we're exploring in Oakland. Our new District 2 council person, Nikki Fortuno-Bass, with the support of TOPA activists and other citywide activists, we've created a $12 million set-aside for building homes, but in density, maybe apartment buildings, that are transitioned into ownership. Right?
Yes.
So those same tax breaks and bond measures that are used to create more perpetual renters who will always remain insecure and in some ways civically disinvested because of the insecurity, we're trying to figure out how to incentivize affordable housing developers to build these builds as they would have as normal, and then transition them through the same things that we would call rents can go into paying down the cost of the project. It's a one-to-one transition if we're thinking towards stabilizing and creating permanent communities instead of rental communities.
Exactly.
And the only solution we have not really surmounted yet is how to recapitalize the fund every year, so it's an ongoing program. But it's really groundbreaking, so.
It's fantastic, yes. The mortgage interest deduction is welfare for those of us with property, and it's a pure subsidy. It's a pure subsidy. And so I think you're really nice in saying, well, let's think about the people who own more than one home. But in the Bay Area, those of us who own a home, the subsidy for that home is quite high. And so what I like to do is ask people, how many of you renters out there are getting $10,000 checks to subsidize your rent? Right? Very few of you.
Actually, if I could just give one statistic.
Yeah.
The average homeowner in California receives 14 times as many tax benefits as the average renter.
Right. There you go. Take it away from me, please. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, sir.
We talk about regionalism.
Right.
And I worked in Stockton the past couple of years. And my question is, what do you view the Bay's relationship to, like Stockton, the Desco, the Central Valley, a region that has been continually left behind in the picture of California when you have Stockton going bankrupt in 2008, highest rate of foreclosure in the nation, and yet it's the most diverse city in America. So.
You guys got that? I don't got that.
I'll start the conversation on that. I've often said after Trump won, Trump won in part because he capitalized on the fears of folks who are struggling in places around our country that are like Stockton. And I think that if California can't figure out how to uplift communities like Stockton, we don't really have business trying to tell the rest of the country what to do. And the reality is we are a state of very wealthy and very poor, folks who have opportunities and folks who don't. It's concentrated on the coasts, the opportunities concentrated on the coasts, and we've got to do a better job in many, many ways of trying to bring some of those economic opportunities to our heartland. But I will also say that Stockton, as folks know, the region, the Bay Area is actually expanding because of this housing crisis, right? When most of the jobs are in job-rich centers, but people now have to commute 2-3 hours a day to get to where they work. To some degree, it's actually starting to connect our communities in ways that are very strange and odd. But there is the quick answer to your question is there's so much we need to do to invest in the Stocktons of California and how to bring some of the economic success, how to export some of the economic success from an educational standpoint, from a job opportunity standpoint, from a housing creation standpoint, from a social investment standpoint.
Good.
And just a quick add-on. So the thing about regionalism as opposed to municipality, municipality, you have fairly clear boundaries. They can be changed, but whenever you're talking about regionalism, that's the first issue, is what's the region? And we can have different regions for purposes of what's the housing region, what's the jobs region, what's the transportation region, what's the nature, environmental, and so that's one of the fights. And then it gets back to your point about coalitions, is that whatever the region, wherever we decide the region is, it's those folks and the folks that are affected that need to get together to be able to figure out how to fix the problems.
Great.
Yeah, there's kind of a discrepancy between what the film's kind of source of its theory of changes and what a lot of the panel is talking about. Ada made very clear that the process is about taking back power, identifying power, and building power for the people. When y'all answered about, coalition building and what to do about some of these crises, there's a lot of parliamentary answers. But actually, it's really just Noni who's kind of hit on a little bit of what Ada was talking about when you pointed out that there's 20,000 vacant housing units here. Ada's movement was about stopping evictions, period, not just about, getting some public money to build more housing, which of course needs to happen as long as it's decommodified. But I'm really interested to know, that platform that Ada ran as a part of was a platform made with movements, not just establishment parties, but movements that were challenging capital, movements that were trying to take public control over, assets that should be public in their view. And I'd love to hear another answer to the coalition question that focuses on what movements there currently are in the Bay Area, like the public bank movement, for example, but I'm sure there's many others that you might think would be meaningful components to a real, progressive or further than progressive coalition to make real change in the Bay Area.
Fantastic. I'd like to go for that first.
The answer that jumps off the page is Moms for Housing. And so there's also differences between politics and government. I think I'm on the pre-call that we had organizing this panel. I was pleased to hear that Ada did get reelected. So obviously people were pleased, but I think we can all think of people who were wonderful candidates, and then governing is hard. Governing is hard. And so when you're thinking about, how to get people into vacant units owned by private capital, you have to do things that entrenched government wouldn't want to do. And someone who comes from the outside like Ada would probably be more open to doing these things, and certainly, in fact, it would be incumbent upon her to do it because that's what the movement demands. So if a movement like Moms for Housing was to coalesce and get in on the inside, then that would be something that would be done. It's very hard. It's very hard to ask current government to do something that the city attorney will tell you can't do.
And relatedly, I did some research about what happened with her administration and what they were able to accomplish and not, and it's very, very mixed. They were able to do a lot of little things, but all the big things they have not been able to do, and it's partly because of the limits of other power around them, the state and banks and all that stuff. But I think, the key thing, in one sense, the key things she was doing was trying to rehabilitate politics and trying to get people to not just give up and feel hopeless. But at the same time, there's just a tension. And the interviews with her that happened after the election and after the second election that she won, she talked specifically about it's been hard to maintain the movement. It's the same thing with Obama. After, he had a good ground game before the election, but then after the election, he was not able to mobilize those people. Unfortunately, I think President Trump has been able to mobilize his people, but on the left, it's that tension of being in power where you actually can change things and still maintaining an authentic connection to the folks that got you there.
Great. Noni?
One more quick thought is that in San Francisco, coalition's often around keeping things from happening. Mm-hmm. And that's easier to get people out than making things happen.
Okay. Noni?
I thank you for that question. We have trouble even mentioning Bernie's name because he's a democratic socialist, right? Like, what we're talking about is a value system, and again, us understanding ourselves differently, right? As non-commodified beings trying to build and maintain a life in this country, which is in tension with this originating promise that we could all consume freely and happily. And we have to extract ourselves, disentangle ourselves from a certain kind of confusion in order to be able to move forward the larger things. So for example, Moms for Housing, right? If you looked at the comments trails while this was happening, there was a real difference in opinion. One was, that's really great. Our people should not be on the street like this. The other was, that's private property. Can I just walk into someone's private property and take it and then it's mine because they're not using it? But there's this middle place that where are the ethics and the collective agreement around how we use private property? What is the function of some socialist policies, right? Is a capitalist policy as a bottom line the greatest good for our nation and our cities, right? Those are the questions we're not really grappling with, right? We're asking, how do we make more capital to build more commodities for which folks can compete on an imbalanced market? That's really the wrong question we're asking. And so in terms of coalition building, as you point out, we often don't get out on the streets because we are consumers rather than humans trying to build and make a good nation here. And that has to experience a fundamental shift. And you see some of that work at lower levels, and it gets more difficult at upper levels. But for example, if you sit in Oakland's Rotunda, you see commercial developers coming out of the mayor's office all day long, so happy, so accommodated, right? Should we be accommodating folks who seek profit first, or should we be accommodating the building of communities and cities, right? So I think some of the questions have to change, and then we'll come out with slightly different solutions, even if it takes several generations to work toward that.
That's fantastic, Noni. As a philosopher, you're speaking right to my heart, digging right into the conflict between our worshiping of private property and how that often, well, I hate to use the word, but it fits here, trumps our other rights, right, in a really important way. We only got a couple of minutes left, so would you guys, any last words about the film or about the topics that you spoke to? Last words.
I just would make a plea that I think part of the beauty and strength of the movie was that it's trying to rehabilitate politics, that too often people exclude themselves. They think it's dirty, blah, blah, blah. But electoral politics is the way we govern ourselves. And if we withdraw from that, which is what the right wing wants us to do, they want to piss us off and demoralize us so that we withdraw into private life and let them have and do all their games. We can't do that. We have to re-engage and we have to rehabilitate politics.
Fantastic. Joe?
I was very impressed with Ada's ability to walk the fine line of skirting the two movements of being a political figure and being an activist. And you could see, I wonder how well she would have done if those confessionals were out during the election, because she was very human, and I don't know how human we allow our politicians to be. And that was, the fact that she was able to push it forward and be reelected was heartening.
David?
To answer the question of the gentleman who asked sort of what movements are there out today, you know, from my vantage point, I see movements every single day, every single hour, from the environmental movement to the choice movement, the LGBTQ movement, Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, tenants movement, public banking movement, single-payer health care. I mean, we can go on and on and on and on. The movements are out there. I think it's a matter of making sure that each of those movements have leadership that are able to lean in at the right time to capture the imagination and the vision of the public at a right time, because different movements crest depending on what's happening on a particular day. And when the movements see the intersectionality with other movements, that's where we really see, I think, fundamental change. And my hope is in 2020 that this will all come together to get rid of that occupant of the White House.
Absolutely.
But whether or not that happens, we've got to, I think everyone, whatever draws you to be here tonight, whatever draws you to politics, you know, hope we all lean in, because this is how we make the world, to be cliched, the better place that we want it to be.
Mm-hmm. Noni?
I appreciate the
Yeah.
cliche. Thank you guys for screening this tonight. I get a little fatigued in my work, and that's a renewal of hope. And this leaning in to the transformations we have to make is really where I commit to continuing to ground my work, and that we can transform things and become a model for the rest of the nation. Although California has its own version of conservatism, it also has a special version of liberalism and generosity that I think keeps me hopeful for the changes we can make and how we can model what's happening in other urban centers nationwide. So we're here to keep our nation safe, but we have to do that not as individuals, but as folks who are neighbors, even to neighbors who don't look or live like us. And there's enough space, there's enough capital, there's 104 billionaires in San Francisco Bay Area alone. That means there's only 74 homeless people per billionaire. This is cited from Winner Take All, if you need to go to the citation. We have solutions right in this room. We have to change what we believe we're here for and what our destiny is together.
That's an amazing and beautiful ending to our wonderful panel. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.